Hey everyone, in today's video we are going to talk all about empathy, and I'm going to share 5 of my favorite picture books to read with your K-2 students to help them kind of understand and recognize what empathy is. In case you're new here, my name is Susan Jones. I am a former 1st grade and K-2 literacy teacher who now spends a lot of time here on YouTube teaching tips, ideas, and strategies to K-2 teachers just like you. Now, I have done a bunch of different picture book suggestion videos. In fact, I have a whole playlist of them right here where I cover a ton of different skills and topics for K-2 students. But in today's video, I'm going to share 5 books on empathy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book and why I love it for teaching this skill. So if you're ready, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. Now, before I dive right into 5 of my favorites, I do want to let you know that when we're teaching our youngest students about empathy, it's a pretty tough skill to actually teach to students. It's one that takes a lot of time for it to really develop, and it's going to develop faster in some students than in others. So it's something that with our youngest kids, we're really trying to expose them to, let them know what it is, and have discussions around empathy. So with empathy, there are 3 main things I like to teach my young students. The first is we want to teach students to be able to recognize emotions and observe body language. Now, we talk a lot about feelings and emotions in K-2 classrooms, and that's for a very important reason. We want our students to be able to recognize and identify different feelings and emotions they might have, but also pick up on that body language and facial expressions that might show those emotions. So not only can we recognize it in ourselves, but that we can recognize it in others as well. And I do have a video with some of my favorite books for teaching about feelings and emotions right there. I'll go ahead and link that down in the description in case you want to check that out after. The second thing we want to teach students about empathy is to embrace similarities and differences in diversity. Now, I think a long time ago, it was often thought of with empathy that, we want to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. But as time has gone on, a lot of social emotional experts in the field recognize that it's not really possible to always put yourself in someone else's shoes. People with all diverse, backgrounds, people with disabilities, different skin colors, different hair colors, born different places around the world. We all have different experiences, but we can still make connections amongst them. So we don't necessarily want to tell somebody that we know exactly how you're feeling, because oftentimes we don't know exactly how they're feeling, but we can relate. We do have a lot of similarities, and that's what we want to focus on. And the third thing we want to teach our students is to be able to have discussions around book characters and make connections. Especially in these younger grades, it's really important for our students to be able to listen to or read a story and try to empathize with the characters in the story. Try to make those connections and have those discussions. It's also the easiest way for us as teachers to kind of bring this up and get them starting to think about empathy in the first place. So with that being number 3, let's dive into my favorite books. My first favorite book for teaching about empathy is The Rabbit Listened by Corey Dorfield. This story is about a little child named Taylor who was building something with his blocks, and it was something amazing that they were very, very proud of. But then out of nowhere, the block tower came crashing down, and he had all sorts of feelings about it. Now, while Taylor is feeling so sad and upset, a bunch of different animals come to try to make him feel better. And each animal comes with some way to make them feel better. The chicken comes and he says, let's talk about it, come on. Let's talk about how you're feeling. But Taylor doesn't want to. A bear comes and tells him to growl and yell and shout about it, and that'll make him feel better. But Taylor doesn't want to do that. Each different animal has their own way of making themselves feel better, but what they're not recognizing is that Taylor doesn't want to do that. That doesn't help Taylor feel better. Finally, at the end, a little rabbit comes over and he just looks at Taylor and he listens to him. He scooches closer and closer, he reads his body language, and finally he just listens. He waits until Taylor is ready to talk, and then Taylor tells him all about his feelings. Only then is Taylor able to, laugh and cry and shout and throw everything away and get really, really upset. And throughout it all, the rabbit never left. He just stayed by his side and supported him. Now, I love this book, especially with my youngest learners, because we talk all the time about how when somebody is feeling upset, we want to listen to what's going to help them feel better and not necessarily place ourselves in their shoes. Again, because if I place myself in Taylor's shoes, I might feel better by screaming and shouting and getting it all out, and then I can like put it behind me. But Taylor might not react that way. We want to ask him what he wants, just like many of our students, if they're feeling upset, may want a big hug to help them feel better. But other students are like, no, I want some personal space right now. They don't want a hug. And that is the first part about empathy, getting to recognize and identify other people's emotions and asking them what they need. All right, book number 2 I love for teaching empathy is Emma and the Whale, and this is by Julie Case. Now, I love this book as kind of a different one. For example, this story is about Julie, and she lives by the ocean. And in this story, she's really showing empathy with a whale. She's showing empathy for an animal that lives in the ocean that actually cannot speak for themselves. She grew up observing sea life and really enjoying all ocean animals and wanting to make sure that they stay safe. Now, in this story, Emma and her dog are playing down by the ocean when they spot a whale, and the whale is stranded on the beach. Now, she runs over and whispers to the whale, "I'm not going to hurt you," and she just wants to help. Again, the whale can't speak here, of course, but Emma knows how scared this whale must be because the whale is stranded on the beach and it looks like a baby whale. As Emma tries to help, she keeps getting pails of water and keeping the whale nice and wet, and she notices that the tide is coming in, and she tells the whale, "Don't worry, soon you can start swimming home." Throughout the entire thing, she stays right next to the whale, and as the tide comes in, she starts to push, and she stays right next to them to keep him company. Kind of reminds me of The Rabbit Listened, where the rabbit just sits next to Taylor. At the end of the story, Emma is able to push the whale right back into the ocean, and they can break out over the sandbar and into the sea. As soon as the little baby whale goes out there, Emma notices that the mother whale must have been waiting right there, and they start singing a little whale song, which Emma thinks they're singing to her, "Goodbye, goodbye." At the end of the day, this story, Emma and the Whale, is such a cute one about this brave little girl who saw an animal, stranded, right? And without being able to speak to the animal, they knew that the animal must feel pretty scared. They're not in their correct environment. And so she stays with the whale until the whale is able to get back into the ocean. Again, it's a really cute one. I don't know about you, but I have had many students in the past who seem to really connect with animals, so this would be a great one for them. Book number 3 I love for teaching about empathy is this one right here. It's called Not So Different by Shane Burka. Now, I love this book for a few reasons. Number 1, it's a nonfiction story, which we don't get a lot of when we're talking about, social emotional topics. And this is by Shane Burka. Him and his wife, I think his wife's name is Hannah. They actually have a YouTube channel that I have somewhat kept up with, but I know their story. And he has done so much for the community, with the disability community, and he shares just his stories, and he decided to make this children's book where kids can, ask him questions, or he answers questions that kids often ask to really teach about empathy. So let me just show you what this one's about. As you can see, the title is What You Really Want to Ask About Having a Disability. Go ahead and ask me. Kids are naturally curious, and their curiosity comes from a great place, so we don't want to stifle that, but we do want to teach students about empathizing with others. So here right away you can see on the book cover, it says, "Why do you look so different?" That must be a question he has gotten many times before, and he goes ahead and explains it in a very simple manner that your students will completely understand. Again, I love this book because it's nonfiction, he is a real person, and he actually shows real life photographs of him growing up with some of the questions. So this first one, what's wrong with you? Of course, nothing is wrong with Shane right here, and he explains that. He explains how he's just a little different because he was born with a disease called spinal muscular atrophy. He explains why his head looks bigger than the rest of his body. He explains how his family helps him, how he eats, and how his chair works. But most importantly, with each of these answers, he makes connections to your students, to kids. He explains that, yes, people help him eat his food, but he likes a ton of the same foods that you do. What does he do on the daily basis? He loves to play video games, just like you. He has a job, just like you. Again, making those connections with those that are different from you. Here at the end, he even says how he can drive his chair about as fast as you can ride your bike. And he makes sure he wears safety straps too. And look he can also pop a wheelie with his brother's help. He likes to have fun, just like you. This book is great. It asks so many questions like, how do you play with your friends? And he even goes into, do people ever make fun of you? And he says, honestly, yeah, they do sometimes, and it hurts his feelings. But it's very important not to judge a book by its cover. I always link all the books I talk about down in the description. This is a book that I thought you might not have heard of before, so I definitely wanted to share it, and it will also be linked down there. Let me know in the comments if you have heard of this book before or if you've read it with your students. I would love to know your feedback. But again, it's great for students to think about those with disabilities, both physical and not physical disabilities, really. But here, of course, he has a physical disability and goes through kind of those curious questions your students might naturally think of. Picture book number 4 I want to share for teaching about empathy is called You, Me, and Empathy. And this one is by Janine Sanders. Now, this book is great. It's about a little child who is kind of recognizing and realizing the world around him in real time. They're recognizing that even though I am still little, I can learn how to kind of react and behave around others based on what I'm seeing. For example, there's all these easy to relate to instances where it says like, my mother was sick with a tummy bug. I knew that she needed a big snuggly hug. And why did he know that? You flip the next page and see that one time when he was sick with the flu, his mother came over, patted his hand, and just kind of comforted him. So he knew that as he gets older and he sees his mom being sick, he has some ideas about what he might be able to do. And then at the end of each scenario, there's these little questions like, who helps when you're sick? How do they make you feel? You could definitely split this book up and not read all of them at one time. There's a bunch of these different scenarios. Here, the brother falls over and hurts his knee. So based on what the brother did for him when he was younger, he decides to do the same thing. He helps him up on a chair. He says, they're there. And again at the bottom, who shows you kindness? In what ways do they show you kindness? And how do you show kindness to others? The book is filled with tons of these scenarios, so I would probably break it up into 2 or 3 days when you're reading these. It's a great thing to do during morning meeting or maybe after recess, before recess, when you have a few minutes. You can talk about each of these scenarios and answer the questions. I even like at the end of the story, it talks a little bit about bullying and someone who would never share, they didn't play fair, and they were kind of really mean, for lack of another word. But this part of the story reminds me of The Recess Queen, where, you know, this bully is being mean to others because they've been made to feel that way themselves before. And so they're just kind of lashing out. This whole book really centers around one question, and it's how can we show others how we care about them? What are some ways we can do that? And again, this book provides all the different scenarios for you to do that. I also like this book because at the end, it has very specific discussion questions for parents, teachers, and caregivers for each of the pages. There's tons for you to really go over with your kids. So this one's kind of a deep dive into empathy and again shares different scenes and scenarios where students can put themselves in those shoes and think about what they would do. How can we show kindness? How can we show empathy? And I mentioned the discussion questions, but also at the back of the book, it has a ton of activities to promote empathy, kindness, and compassion. There's a bunch of little ones which are pretty helpful. And last but not least, book number 5 for teaching all about empathy is The Invisible Boy. Now, I have mentioned this book at least in one of my other picture book suggestions. Love this book for so many reasons. It is by Tracy Ludwig, and let me tell you why I like it for empathy. This story is about a little boy named Brian. He's a school-age child, so you'll see a lot of kind of school-based scenarios, but essentially he feels invisible. No one's ever talking to him, no one's inviting him to birthday parties, but he just kind of goes amongst his day. And one day they have a new kid, Justin, to the class, and Justin, gives Brian a little bit of attention. Brian writes Justin a nice note, and then Justin comes over and talks to him. And they kind of kick off a little bit of a friendship. You can start to see the color come back to Brian's illustration. Throughout the story, Justin makes friends with a lot of the other classmates, and really he could just go on ignoring Brian like everybody else in the class does, but instead he decides to involve him. He wants to involve him in the project that he's doing with friends, and you can see how it makes Brian feel. At the end of the story, these little interactions that him and Justin have really make Brian feel seen. They make him feel like a part of the class, a part of the classroom, and he goes from being the invisible boy to the visible boy. Maybe he's not so invisible after all. Now, I love this book for so many reasons, but why do I love it for empathy? This story really emphasizes that we need to think about others, right? We can't just focus on ourselves. If we notice Brian always sitting there, if we just take a second to look around and see that one of our classmates is looking kind of sad, one of our classmates isn't really talking to anyone during lunchtime, what can we do? we can actually go out of our way to show that we care about this person by inviting them to sit with us, having a conversation with them, seeing what game they want to play. All of those things are showing empathy. We're trying to empathize with Brian. We are trying to reach out to him and show him that we care. So there you are. Those are 5 of my favorite picture books for teaching all about empathy. Now I know there are so many others, so if you have another picture book, especially geared towards K-2, that you love for teaching about empathy, please drop it down in the comments below. I love reading picture book suggestions. I have a whole bunch of picture books behind me, but I still like to get more. Also, it usually works out for Theo and Calvin's teachers. For example, I accidentally ordered 2 copies of The Rabbit Listened, so I shared one with them. As always, I do hope you enjoyed these picture book suggestions. Like I said, I have a whole playlist right here where I share all sorts of books geared towards K-2 for all types of skills. So go check that out. This video will be added to that playlist right after it airs. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.